Okay, and so let's talk about this album here, Help. And let me be very clear. What I am holding here is the studio album, which was released in the UK on the Parlophone label, and it is not the soundtrack to the film Help. That was released by Capitol Records in the United States. But both of these records came out simultaneously on the same day in both countries on August 6th, 1965. There are many similarities in these two different releases, but the film soundtrack has 5 numbers that were played and recorded by the Ken Thorne Orchestra, and the remaining 7 songs are just standard Beatles songs that were recorded in London with George Martin producing. And so yeah, we are reviewing the studio version of the album and not the film soundtrack. And there is so much going on here with this record. So many great leaps forward by this group in so many different ways. 14 songs, and 12 of them are originals written either by Lennon and McCartney or else George Harrison. First and foremost, the Beatles took a long-earned, month-long vacation starting right after the Christmas holidays of 1964, and they didn't get back together again to start working in the studio until the middle of February of 1965 at EMI Studios. This is also significant because this marks really kind of the first time that there was any songwriting going on with Lennon and or McCartney while they were not always together in the same room. For example, the song Yesterday was written completely by McCartney on his own while he was staying at his girlfriend Jane Asher's place, which was located at 57 Wimpole Street in London. Although John did finally help him decide on a song title, and more on that part later. The exact same thing can be said about the song I've Just Seen a Face, also completely a Paul McCartney song. Even though the arrangement between these two were that all of their compositions would be credited to Lennon and McCartney, these two songs were Paul's almost 100%. And now this seems to make more sense why John Lennon would end up constantly making fun of the song Yesterday, calling it, quote, Paul's granny music, unquote. He didn't like the song, and of course he didn't. He didn't have anything to do with the writing of it, and he continued to use that derogatory term with many of Paul's other compositions over the years that he didn't particularly like or agree with. But here's the one that really started all of that. This is the song that could be credited with ratcheting up the tension between Lennon and McCartney, and where their individual instincts for competition and control of the band's material really began to come to a head. Either way, George Martin believed greatly in the potential of this song, and as he was listening to Paul sit on a chair and play it with just simply an acoustic guitar, George Martin was writing the string section in his own head. And so here's another couple of firsts for the Beatles: a recorded string section in a song, and also one that featured only one single member of the group playing and singing on a Beatles song. No other group members are on this recording other than Paul on guitar and vocals, and then of course the strings, which were arranged by George Martin. We could talk for a lot longer about just this song alone, but I'm going to try to cut it kind of short. John Lennon was not the only one who was starting to grow annoyed with Paul and this song that he was writing all by himself. While the band were in the process of actually filming scenes for the movie Help, there was a piano nearby that was on the set. And every time the director would yell, "Cut," and stop to confer with his various assistants about, the script, camera angles, or whatever, Paul would take the opportunity to walk over to this piano and sit down and start tinkering around with the chords to the song. And finally, at one point, the director, whose name was Richard Lester, completely lost his temper with Paul and yelled at him to stay away from the piano while he was trying to work out an issue. Then he had someone come in and remove the piano so that Paul couldn't play around with it anymore. And to make matters worse, Paul wrote the chords to this song first, and he didn't even have a draft of the final lyrics. So these were the lyrics that he was using to write the melody and to solidify the chord progression. Just have a listen to this. Scrambled eggs. Oh my baby, how I love your legs. Not as much as I love scrambled eggs. Oh, I believe in scrambled eggs. And I'm not kidding about this either. That story is ridiculously well documented in Beatles lore. So, any way you want to look at this song, the final version, with the much better lyrics, of course, ended up hitting number 1 on the charts in 8 different countries. And while there are no real fans of Rolling Stone magazine over here, that publication has it listed as number 13 on their list of 500 greatest songs of all time. And they ranked it as the 4th greatest Beatles song of all time, for whatever that's worth. According to BMI, this song has been covered, legally speaking, by over 3,000 different artists worldwide to date. And that's a world record by a moonshot. And they claim that it is actually the 3rd most played song of all time on radio and television. The BBC voted yesterday as the greatest song written in the 20th century. And while we don't necessarily agree completely with that assessment, as far as we're concerned, it's not even the greatest song on this album. But if you want to judge it just by the money that it generated and international chart success, well, then yeah, I suppose you could make that argument if you really wanted to. But like we said, John Lennon hated it, and he made fun of it constantly, right up to the very end of his own days. George Martin was afraid to even release it on a Beatles album because he thought that the others might be outraged, and in his mind, that could have split up the band. Bob Dylan, along with George Harrison on the guitar, actually attempted to even record a cover version of this song himself in 1970, but he never released it because he didn't like how it turned out. Music and songs are a funny thing. Scrambled eggs, indeed. Now, let's talk about one of John Lennon's personal songs on this record. You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. In our collective opinions over here, is not only the best overall song on this particular record, it could arguably be the most musically advanced and lyrically mature song that the Beatles have actually recorded up to this point in their history. It really is one of their truly great songs in what we'll refer to as the pre-Rubber Soul era. About the only other one that we can think of that could possibly give this song a run for its money prior to the Rubber Soul album would be I'll Follow the Sun, which was on the release right before this one, Beatles for Sale. This song, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, is just stunning. And even if it had been on the Rubber Soul album, it would still have been one of the more standout tracks within that collection of songs. It's poignant, and it's deeply personal, and it shows a tremendous growth in John Lennon's early songwriting period. And there's so many different things that are going on within this song. First off, according to Lennon, he considers this to be the closest thing that he's ever written to a Bob Dylan song. John was obsessed with Dylan's music at this time, and he was listening to it on an almost daily basis from late 1964 and throughout all of 1965. In an interview several years after the song was recorded, John had this to say about it, quote, "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away is me in my Dylan period. I am like a chameleon, influenced by whatever is going on. It's one of those that you sing a bit sadly to yourself. I'd started thinking about my own emotions, but instead of projecting myself into a situation, I would try to express what I felt about myself. I think it was Dylan who helped me realize that. Not by any discussion or anything, but just by hearing his work, unquote. It's often been suggested that John was writing directly about Beatles manager Brian Epstein, who was a very guarded, closeted homosexual who was trying to cope with living his own life as he wanted to, but also doing everything he could to keep his personal life to himself out of a fear of professional and/or personal retribution. Back then, in the UK, just like many parts of the United States, it was often very unwise for someone to become a bit too relaxed or unguarded about their own personal sexual identity or gender preferences. In fact, up until the Sexual Offences Act of 1967 was passed, homosexual behavior in the UK was illegal, and you could go to prison for it. Brian Epstein's career as the manager of the Beatles was the envy of many different people in the music industry back then, and he was fearful that someone would attempt to either blackmail him or purposely spread salacious rumors about him to the press, and then he would suffer from it professionally. We're actually going to talk a lot more about Brian Epstein in particular, possibly in the very next Beatles episode, because his personal story is not only interesting, it's also very tragic. And we feel like sometimes, because he died so young at the age of 32, he often gets overlooked or sometimes even forgotten from much of the Beatles' history. Anyway, yeah, so that's one possible theory about the origins of this song. But here's another one. It has always been widely known, and even admitted by John Lennon himself, that he was often unfaithful to his first wife, Cynthia. If the song is possibly about John's feelings regarding his own marital infidelity, it certainly would not be the last time that he wrote about this very topic. He has stated many times that the song Norwegian Wood on the Rubber Soul album was written as essentially a confession about his many extramarital affairs that he had while still married to his first wife. But as for this one, it's not out of the question, and it's possible that the song is a mixture of a lot of what John was feeling at the time, and other things that he was going through as he was becoming increasingly famous, wealthy, and also, as a result, more isolated from the rest of society. That's the second theory. Now, here's the third one, and it's the most controversial one of all. And we were actually even just a bit hesitant to even include this part in the story, but we will anyway. So, before you try to reach into the screen and bite my head off or something like that, please understand that we don't just idly attempt to spread gossip about people who are no longer here to defend themselves. This is something where we were sure to cross-reference with several different sources before we said anything about it at all. This theory is related to the 12-day trip that John Lennon and Brian Epstein took on their own to Barcelona, Spain in April of 1963. It was just them, and no other band members, wives, girlfriends, or anybody else on the management team were invited. Brian invited John by himself, and John accepted the invitation. Now, that in and of itself means nothing at all. And even if it did, well, I guess that's their business, and maybe we don't really have any business speculating or even talking about it, really. But I can guarantee you that a lot of other people at that time did ask a lot of questions. Remember, this was in 1963. In fact, just so you know that this is not something that we're just pulling out of thin air, I want you to listen to this recording of Paul McCartney himself in a BBC interview sometime in the 1990s, where he was asked point blank for his own opinions about what he thought this whole thing was about. And you can tell by the relaxed tone in his voice that he's not shocked by this question at all. And you can tell that the topic has definitely come up before. So, here he is.
I don't actually know the truth of the John rumor. To my knowledge, John was never gay. It might have been, I've suspected that the John thing and Brian was a power play on John, because John was a very political animal. And John, I suspect, went away on that Spanish holiday or wherever it was. Number one, because nobody went on holiday, so anyone, I would have gone. Anyone would have gone. Oh, for free holiday? You kidding? Yes, I'm there. Number two, I'm sure John took Brian aside and said, hey, you want to deal with this group? I'm the guy you deal with, okay? John was that kind of guy, very sensible, very pragmatic. So I'm sure that was the main reason John went there. Now, as to whether there was any sort of gay dalliance or whatever, I don't know. I can't tell you that. But I know that Brian was very straightforward with me about it. We could talk about it quite openly, particularly obviously once we got to know each other. And I say, he never hit on me.
When we do get to Brian Epstein's complicated story in a later episode, his personal feelings for John, which were not romantically reciprocated, by the way, will become a lot more clear. But it's going to take a much deeper discussion, which is why we're going to leave this one right where it is for now. Any way you might choose to look at this, the bottom line here is that, like I said earlier, this song was extremely personal to John Lennon. And whatever judgment the rest of the world has passed on him due to a lot of his difficult and questionable behavior throughout his life, I think that we can at least agree that You've Got to Hide Your Love Away was a bold statement as a song, and that John Lennon was an intelligent and a thoughtful person. Flawed, but a very talented songwriter. This is a beautiful song, and we think that it is the highlight of this record. So, how about some of the other highlights on the album Help? Well, what about just the title track itself? Is it just a power pop song with a good steady and upbeat tempo? No, it's not. And it's much more than that. This is another one credited to both Lennon and McCartney, but just like the previous one that we were just talking about, this is another one written almost completely by John Lennon, and is also very highly confessional. When John says, help, he claims that he actually meant it in that very literal way. Paul said that John wrote about 70% of the song, and that he wrote the other 30% of it, but his claim to the song was merely just to help John complete it, because he had been struggling with it for several weeks. So Paul came over to John's place, and they completed the final verse and fit the rest of the chord progression together all in a single afternoon. It's a great song, and it's a typically well-crafted Beatles pop song, even if it does have a bit of a darker meaning to it. Here's something that John said about this song. Quote, "The whole Beatles thing was just beyond comprehension. I was eating and drinking like a pig, and I was fat as a pig. I was dissatisfied with myself, and when this song and film came out, subconsciously, I was crying out for help. Most people think it's just a fast rock and roll song. I didn't realize it at the time. I just wrote the song because I was commissioned to write it for the movie. But later, I knew I really was crying out for help. So it was my fat Elvis period. You see, in the movie, my character is very fat, very insecure, and he's completely lost himself. And I am singing about when I was so much younger and all the rest, looking back at how easy it was back then." Unquote. One other thing here to keep in mind. John, just as all the rest of the guys in the Beatles, are all smoking a lot of pot at this time, both together and alone by themselves as they attempt to write songs. Go back to our episode number 1 and watch the part about the very first meeting with Bob Dylan in New York City on the 28th of August, 1964. That will help to explain some of this. They're all experimenting with marijuana quite heavily at this point, and in particular, John is beginning to become really introspective in his writing. By April of 1965, John, and I'm not so sure about the other three, but he is also beginning to dabble a bit in LSD. And he's also using this drug as a way to get in touch with his deeper feelings. Here are some more of his thoughts on this song in particular. This is what John had to say about it. Quote, "I meant it It's real. The lyric is as good now as it was then. It is no different, and it makes me feel secure to know that I was aware of myself back then. It was just me singing help, and I meant it. I don't like the recording too much. I think we did it too fast, just trying to be commercial." Unquote. Overall, the things about this record that are a vast improvement and a big leap forward for the group coming off of Beatles for Sale are: 1. The use of several different types of instruments in the studio. We've already mentioned the strings on Yesterday, but there's also a double-tracked flute. There's George Martin in there playing more piano on several of these tracks, and because studio technology was rapidly advancing at that time, they were able to make greater use of their abilities to overdub additional vocal parts and more percussion instruments, adding them into the mix later after they had already laid down the basic rhythm tracks together as a band. So this record really is the beginning of the Beatles starting to make greater use of the studio as almost another instrument, so to speak. Whereas on earlier records, they felt like they were limited to recording entire songs together, but not being able to add much else to the songs later. In fact, there is an interesting piece of trivia that just kind of sums up this whole thing. On the night of April 13th, 1965, the band were making attempts to record a final version of the title track, Help. They ended up recording a total of 12 takes of the song before they finally nailed it on the last one. But there are still copies of that recording session, and all 12 takes are still there on those master tapes. At the beginning of take 4, George Harrison can be heard attempting to communicate with producer George Martin in the control booth that he is having some kind of difficulty pulling off what he described as a technically difficult guitar part that's somewhere in this song. Harrison states that there was no way that he could get that guitar part played cleanly while also singing at the same time. Well, then Paul McCartney chimes in, and he reassures Harrison that he doesn't even have to sing his vocal part at this point in the recording process. He reminds Harrison that there will end up being 2 additional and unused tracks at the end that will be used for overdubbed vocal parts later. Apparently George either didn't know this or else he just forgot and assumed that he still needed to both sing and play his guitar parts all on the same take, just like they used to have to do on previous records. And 2. Other than those previously mentioned things, we also have a record with much more thoughtful lyrics, more original material, and less cover songs. And again, I hate to break this to you, but just like the review that we did on their last record, the 2 cover songs that they put on this record are also, relatively speaking, the 2 weakest overall tracks on this record. They're both out of place, and they don't really match up that well with the direction that the group seemed to be headed in by this point in their collective careers. The song Act Naturally is not an awful song, but they really didn't put a whole lot of thought into this one in terms of where it was actually going to end up, either on this record or just simply as a B-side to the Yesterday single. In earlier years, the cover songs that the Beatles put on their records, for better or for worse, were actually songs that they had been playing for years in their live sets in Hamburg and at the Cavern Club in Liverpool. But not this one. This is a song that Ringo heard on some Buck Owens record that he had, and on a whim, he just approached them with it and said, "Hey, I like this one, and I'd like to sing it if that's okay with the rest of you." Nobody objected to that, and no one else seemed really like they cared that much about it either way. They were all consumed with the other things that they were writing at the time, and this was just one of those songs that Ringo got to do once on each record. It was the token Ringo vocal song. And so on the 17th of June, 1965, they ran through the song about a dozen times to get familiar with it, and they just worked out some generic country and western chord stylings with George noodling around on the guitar with some of the things that he knew about how to play in that genre. And that's really about it for this one. Ringo only sang this song one time, and they decided that that one take was good enough, and so they just kept it and moved on to something else. Look, it's really not that bad. It's not a bad song. In fact, on its own, it's actually kind of cool. But it just doesn't really hold up that well to the rest of the material that surrounds it on this record. The other cover song is Dizzy Miss Lizzy. And unlike the previous one that we just talked about, this is one that they were familiar with, and they had been playing it in their live sets for years. From what we can gather, it seems like the decision for including this song on the Help record was because some of them felt like they needed to follow up the song Yesterday with something that sounded a bit more like traditional rock and roll. I'm not sure that this worked out exactly in the way that maybe they thought it would. Lennon obviously thought that Yesterday was schmaltzy, and so he wanted to sing Dizzy Miss Lizzy himself because he believed that he could do it quickly and easily, and they could just get it done with as little effort as possible. And then, after a few takes, as the story goes, he got into an argument with George Martin in the control booth because Martin said to Lennon that his vocals just were not exciting enough and that he was singing it in a lackluster and kind of a boring way. Lennon took offense to that. So they took a break from it and went off and recorded something else for a while. Then they came back to it later, and John decided to more or less just kind of yell and almost scream out the vocals just to piss off George Martin. Well, it's spirited, to say the least, but it's still basically kind of a weak song. It's somewhat repetitive, and from the sound of it, maybe it's just one of those Beatles songs that George Martin was like, fuck this. Just finish it and let's get on to something better. This is not one of those songs that George Martin would have put a whole lot of effort into from a production standpoint. Now, when I was a little kid, in about the 4th grade, I actually really liked this song. But that's because I was 9. We gave this record a final rating of 8.3 out of 10, which is a B. It's not an A. No matter how nostalgic we are for records like these, and no matter how much we might love and enjoy it, that's not a factor in how we come up with these grades. It is a very good record, and it is enjoyable, especially if you're a Beatles fan, to listen to it and hear how much they're growing as musicians and songwriters. And that is exactly what is going on here. They are growing, and they're getting so much better at what they do. This is a huge step forward for them when you compare it to Beatles for Sale. And in August of 1965, it's really only been 8 months since they released that last one. But this is not Rubber Soul, and it's not Revolver. It's not Abbey Road, and it's certainly not Sgt. Pepper. It's Help, and we gave it an 8.3 out of 10. I know some of you out there are going to vehemently argue this point with us, and that's fine. You can think whatever you want about it. All we ask is that you try to stay as civil about it as you possibly can. There is a tendency to always want to overrate basically all of the Beatles records because there really has almost never been a group in history that has received as much hype or been marketed quite as successfully as they have been for decades. This is a band that still sells records today, and their influence crosses over multiple generations, which is a total rarity. We love the Beatles over here, and we always will. And we will always acknowledge the incredible impact that they have had and that they continue to have on music and pop culture. Most of their fame and the permanent hype that surrounds them is more than warranted, and it has to be acknowledged. But they are not bulletproof, and neither is every single song that they've put onto every record that they've released. Just wait until we get to Rubber Soul, and we point out a couple of the clunkers that are on that record. Also, please come back and join us again next time because we have another massive album release that's coming up from Bob Dylan. 24 days after the Beatles dropped Help on us, Dylan followed up with Highway 61 Revisited. And oh boy, what a record that was. He was just hitting his stride at that point, and we can't wait to talk about it. And as always, you've been watching the Vinyl Review. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.